Hey art nerds, it is a really gross, wet, thunderstormy, rainy day today, and that makes it perfect for us to do a watercolor field test, or at least for us to talk about the PWC watercolors from ShinHan. A while back, I did an unbox and swatch video where I reviewed the basic set and then a handful of additional colors. Since then, I have been purchasing PWC watercolors left and right from David's Art Supply, and I've accrued quite a collection. So if you guys are interested in my initial thoughts, if you guys want to see how these swatch, and if you want to learn more about ShinHan's PWCs, then you can check out the video. You'll find a link to that down in the description below. Speaking of description, you guys will also find a transcript for this field test. It's not a full transcript, but it's the basic show notes that'll help you decide whether or not PWC watercolors are a good fit for you and for your art. Just a caveat, I am not a fine artist. I am not a fine art watercolor artist. I am a comic artist and illustrator. So when I review art supplies, it's with that in mind. If you guys would like to check out my work, you can read my webcomic at 7inchcara.com or 7inchcara.tumblr.com. The second volume is now in print and available in the Natto shop. Or you guys can check out my Instagram at instagram.com/nattosoup. So for today's field test, I'm using an illustration from the 2019 edition of Lilliputian Living. If you guys are not familiar with Lilliputian Living is my yearly world building challenge. I do it every October, and I'm basically developing the Lilliputian world by creating illustrations, creating characters, creating clothing, creating homes and scenarios, and then writing a prompt to go along with it. We are now on the 4th volume, and all 4 volumes out have been compiled into one compendium stupendium, also known as Lilliputian Living, which is also available in the Natto shop. So the prompt for this illustration was Japanese maple, and I wanted to make sure I captured those fall feelings, the crisp, cool air, the autumn sunshine filtered through the leaves during golden hour, and the brilliant colors of the Japanese maple leaves. So to begin, I applied a wash of water and then I dabbed in a warm yellow to kind of create this warm sunlit glow. I dabbed up just a little bit of the excess yellow from the faces, so that way we can actually capture the whites of eyes. And then using a thirsty flat brush, I streaked in some more saturated warm yellow to kind of create those God rays, that dappled sunlight that you sometimes get. To capture the movement of the falling fall leaves, I'm also splattering in some of the basic colors that I used. So now I want to make sure I really capture those beautiful, beautiful Japanese maple leaves, and I want to capture the colors that you can get with them, from yellows and goldens to bright scarlet and vermilion and even greens and browns. So I'm working fairly saturated, wet into wet, using the PWC watercolors. And this is where I first started to notice just how finely milled the pigments in these watercolors are. We're not really getting any granulation, but we do get some really beautiful wet into wet ombre blending. Now you can overflood it and create lighter patches by having too much water in there, but another beautiful thing about these watercolors is that you can easily paint over them. They're not going to turn to mud, and some of the colors have enough opacity that they can actually stand up to repeated layering. So I'm working pretty heavily from reference here. Google is your friend because I want to make sure I really capture how beautiful Japanese maple leaves are faithfully. So I found some really good reference photos that capture them up close and show the range of color that you can get with these leaves. So I'm using that as my inspiration. I want to point out that these watercolors don't require a long activation time. They activate quite readily, and it reminds me a bit of Mijello watercolors. The half pans, which were filled from tubes, don't exhibit any cracking and aren't prone to falling out of the pans. This isn't the case with some of the other brands that I've reviewed here on the channel. I'm definitely thinking of the cheap Artfol watercolors. Those things were constantly falling out of the pans, and I had to use gum arabic to kind of glue them back in. I'm not sure what binder PWC uses for these specific watercolors. I know with their Korean watercolors, those are more of a traditional watercolor, and those are using kind of a hide glue. In fact, I have a bottle of that hide glue propping this image up. It makes a wonderful watercolor prop to make sure that I'm painting at an angle, but I am fairly certain that their PWC watercolors don't use that as a binder. If you guys know what binder they're using, let me know down in the description below. It works really well. The blues are really beautiful, clean and vibrant. You're not going to get any yellowing, and the colors aren't prone to muddying. Speaking of muddying, I'm really layering the colors on here wet into wet, and I'm using a range for the most part of really warm colors, although we do get some yellows and greens in one or two of the leaves here. So for this illustration, I'm going to use a couple of ceramic palettes to help me out, and I'm going to do a little bit of underpainting using a red-violet mix. So a little bit of purple, a little bit of red, a little bit of red-violet, and I'm also going to mix up a blush. And this is a common technique I use when I'm painting people with darker skin tones. Doing this underpainting allows me to establish the shadows earlier on, and it also means I'm not applying light glazes of purple and violet and blush tones and possibly lifting up all the colors that I've applied beforehand, or even creating mud. And I've talked about this in depth in a few different tutorials that I'll link down in the description below, along with links to where you can buy PWC watercolors and the transcript for this video. This isn't a full transcript because I gotta be honest with you guys, I kept forgetting I was actually reviewing these. I just had such a good time painting with the PWC watercolors that I just kind of lost myself and really enjoyed working with them. I did take some notes, so fear not, this is still useful, but these are really relaxing, fun watercolors. They're very finely milled. There's not really much granulation to these. So if you're a watercolor artist who really prizes granulation and the effects that granulation can bring to your art, these aren't really going to be the watercolors for you, but they do deliver beautiful pigmentation, high chroma, lots of lots of saturation, good saturation in color, a nice range of colors available, a very fair price tag ranging for like $5.50 for Series 1 up to around $12 for Series D. The tubes are similar in size and similar in appearance to Holbein's PWC watercolors, so you may find these to be a good dupe for the Holbeins. I do find that they have a lot in common with Holbein watercolors. I like both ShinHan's PWC watercolors and Holbein's watercolors. I might like the PWCs just a scooch more since Holbein is very expensive here in the US, but if you live in Japan or if you're traveling, you should definitely pick them up while you're abroad because they are way cheaper in Japan. So PWC is ShinHan's professional watercolor, hence PWC. Now they also make a line of professional watercolors that are like ShinHan professional watercolor. Those are the ones in the skinnier tubes. I've reviewed those here on the channel as well. They're good. They have a lot of the same qualities as the PWC watercolors, but I like the PWC watercolors better. I feel like the skinnier tube professional watercolors or more like a very nice student grade watercolor, but they still handle more like a student grade watercolor, whereas the PWC watercolors definitely handle like professional grade watercolors. So I've noticed that the colors mix together really well. I'm able to get really clean mixes. So if you're mixing a lot of skin tones, if you do watercolor comics, if you do portraits, if you do watercolor illustration, and you tend to paint really tiny faces like I do here, you're really going to like PWC watercolors because they're so finely milled. You're going to get these really clean colors, and on super tiny faces, those clean colors are really important because a little bit of sedimentation, a little bit of granulation in the wrong place on a super tiny face can make the face unreadable or turn the face to mud. So it's really nice that I'm able to mix them and I can get really nice clean mixes. Now the pigment particles are really fine, so I did notice that my mixes kind of fell out of solution quickly, so I recommend remixing your paints and your mixes often. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the color is rich and saturated. You get a lot of bang for your buck with these. A little bit goes a long way. Very similar to the Mijello watercolors, which, now that I think about it, both Mission Gold and ShinHan are Korean watercolor companies, so maybe there's something there. The color can be easily lifted back up, although not back to white, but up enough while still wet. But once it's dry, I did not notice it lifting, it moving, or it turning to mud. I'm painting today on Legion's Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press. My brain wanted to mix all those words together into word salad. And I really like painting on Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press. It's not my favorite watercolor paper, but it's a very affordable 100% cotton rag watercolor paper that's accessible through a lot of places. I buy mine through Dick Blick, but you can find it at a lot of places. It's available in blocks that are bound on two sides as well as in pads. This was cut from the block and then stretched to provide additional support. This illustration was inked with the Sakura Pigma FB. Those of you who watch my channel know I love Sakura's Pigma FB brush pins. These are waterproof and alcohol marker safe, and you can find them just about anywhere. They're available in 3 sizes, the FB, the MB, and the BB, so fine brush, medium brush, and big brush. Speaking of, if you enjoy the work that I do, if you enjoy my reviews, if you find them helpful, useful, and informative, it would really mean the world to me if you considered subscribing and if you left me a like. If you guys have any questions or if you just want to talk about your experiences with ShinHan PWC watercolors, or if you want to recommend a watercolor for me to review, please let me know down in the comments below. I love hearing from you guys. As I mentioned earlier, this illustration is from Lilliputian Living, and if you're one of my fantastic, phenomenal art nerds on Patreon, then you can color along with me because I make my Lilliputian Living coloring sheets available every year to my amazing art nerds. If you're not an art nerd and you'd like to color these sheets, you can join now, and theoretically you can search for Lilliputian Living on Patreon and it should bring up the coloring sheets. But if you're having difficulty finding them, let me know in the Paint Box, my art-centric Discord server, and I'll be sure to send you a link so you guys can color along with me. That's just one of the many perks of joining me over on Patreon. As with most of the things I review on the channel, these were purchased out of my own pocket because I thought I'd enjoy using them, and I do enjoy using them. So my opinions are my own and are colored by my 6 years of art education, 4 years for a BA, 2 years for an MFA, my years of reviewing art supplies, and my years of painting watercolor comics. So a little bit more about my experiences with PWC watercolors. The colors seem generally very finely milled, and some are a bit opaque, which works decently well for layering in this instance. So with some of those leaves, you guys saw me go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's what I mean by they work well for layering. The colors are really saturated due to the quick activation and fine granulation, and saturation control can be a bit difficult, so I recommend working with a palette. Even if you're working directly from the half pans, do a little bit of your mixing just to make sure you get a fine color mix or a good color mix. using a palette. I'm using a cheap ceramic plate for Dollar Tree as my larger palette, and then a more expensive, actually designated as a palette, ceramic palette that I purchased at David's a while back. Saturation control can be difficult because you do get a lot of color fast, so that's why I recommend going ahead and mixing using a palette. These would probably be great for folks who want to be done after just a couple of layers. As I mentioned earlier, the colors mix together well and you can get some really clean mixes. The pigment particles are really fine, so they do tend to fall out of solution, so remix your mixes often. They also don't really disperse or granulate, but you can do some really gentle, controlled gradation and ombre effects evident in the leaves in the background. And really, these are a delight to paint with. I'm really enjoying using these. Recently, I purchased a larger Meeden palette to actually hold most of my PWC watercolors. And I definitely plan on picking these up more often and painting with them because they're a lot of fun. They're just very easy, very natural to paint with. And I would recommend these for someone who's newer to watercolor because they're inexpensive, they're professional grade, and they're fairly mild-mannered. They're not tricky paints. You don't have to know any special watercolor tricks to use these. So normally, those of you who have watched my channel before, you guys know I don't really care for student grade watercolors and I don't like to recommend them to other artists. Here in the US, student grade watercolors often cost almost as much as their professional grade counterparts, and they're full of fillers and optical brighteners, so in the long run, they're not as economical as professional grade watercolors. Frankly, they don't even handle the same as professional watercolors because they're going to be chalky, they're going to lift up more easily, and they're more likely to turn to mud. You also run through student grade watercolors really quickly. If I were to recommend a set for someone to start with, PWC watercolors are high on my list of these are great economical professional grade watercolors to start with. I haven't seen them available in half pans, but you're able to fill your own half pans from the tubes. They're not going to crack, they're not going to fall out, they reactivate very easily. And if you were to work with an airtight palette like one of the Mijello palettes or one of the silicone gasket palettes that you guys can find on AliExpress, the kind designed to keep your watercolors wet and open in between painting sessions, that might be an even better fit for you. With the way I paint, because I paint comics, I really prefer working from semi-dry half pans, and these work great for that as well. So I really enjoy them. They layer beautifully. There's just enough opacity that it makes it worth your while to do layering, and not every color is going to be super opaque. You do get some really beautiful jewel-like translucent colors with PWC as well. Now, I haven't reviewed every PWC watercolor tube. I'm slowly amassing a collection. Those of you who watch the unboxing swatch know I started with a basic set and a few useful open stock colors, and since then I've just kind of gone crazy buying colors that I don't already own in other brands. So I have a bit of a mishmash of a collection, but that works well for me because it works with what I already have. Now, since these watercolors are fairly opaque, they may obscure inked line arts. So to just kind of add additional contrast or to readjust your initial contrast and to help reduce muddiness, you may want to re-ink some areas. That's going to bump that contrast back up and it's going to add some clarity back to your piece. That's not a huge detriment to these watercolors. That's not saying these watercolors are not high quality. That's just something to keep in mind, and it's something that I do with, say, Daniel Smith watercolors as well. It's not really a judgment call. So the pros and cons of PWC watercolors. Let's start with the cons. They're still kind of difficult to find. I was able to purchase these open stock at my local art supply store, David's Art Center in Metairie, Louisiana, which if you've never been, I highly recommend it. But I haven't seen them sold anywhere else. I've never seen them at Jerry's. I've never seen them at Plaza. I've never seen them at Paper and Ink Arts. I've never seen them at Dick Blick. That doesn't mean they don't carry it. It just means I've never seen them. If you'd like your store to carry them, put in a request. Ask them to carry them. You can find them on Amazon, and I'll be sure to link them in the description below. But if you're in the greater New Orleans area, why not head on down to David's and buy them directly and support a local business? Now for the pros. They're quite affordable, especially from David's Art Supply. They come in full-size tubes similar to the PWC watercolors. They have a lot in common with the Holbein watercolors. They come in a beautiful array of colors, so if you've been avoiding certain colors because they tend to be price prohibitive, these are a great way to add those colors to your collection. They're finely granulated, they are very, very brilliant, very saturated, and they're quick to activate. In general, they are very easy watercolors to use that I would recommend for an experienced watercolor artist as well as a beginner. And I can definitely see illustrators and comic artists really enjoying these watercolors. They set up beautifully in half pans. They don't crack, they don't crumble. You're not going to have to add additional gum arabic. And while they do lift easily while they're still wet, once they're dry, they're not going to turn to mud if you add layers on top of them. So I highly recommend PWC watercolors. I really enjoy them, and I think you guys will really enjoy them as well. In fact, they were on my top 20 of 2020 list and my top 10 recommended products of 2020. So I hope you guys will check them out. I hope you guys found this video to be helpful, useful, and informative. Let me know what you guys think of PWC watercolors down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys, or come hang out with me on my Discord server, The Paint Box. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon. If you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, please consider joining me over on Patreon. I've got a list of my amazing patrons coming up. So thank you guys so much for your support. You make work like this possible. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.